June 15, 2023. Papua New Guinea Highlands, 35 kilometers southwest of Mount Wilhelm. 14:20 hours. Dr. Sarah Chen crouches beside twisted aluminum that's been oxidizing in jungle humidity for nearly 8 decades, using a brush to clear moss and vegetation from what was once the tail section of a B-24 Liberator bomber. The metal so corroded that it crumbles slightly under her touch, revealing stenciled numbers that make her heart race. 42, 2363. Sarah is 38 years old, an aviation archaeologist from UCLA who specializes in locating and excavating World War II crash sites in the Pacific, who's spent 3 weeks trekking through Papua New Guinea jungle following oral histories from village elders who remember seeing a silver bird fall from the sky when they were children, who's been searching for this specific aircraft for 6 years, because the mystery of its disappearance destroyed the reputations of 10 men whose families have spent 79 years trying to prove they weren't cowards or traitors. The B-24 that Sarah is excavating disappeared on March 7, 1944, during a bombing mission against Japanese positions at Wewak on Papua New Guinea's north coast. The aircraft, codenamed Lucky Star, was part of a 9-plane formation from the 43rd Bombardment Group that attacked Japanese airfields at 0940 hours, dropped their ordnance successfully, and turned south toward their base at Port Moresby, 320 miles away. 8 bombers returned safely. Lucky Star vanished without radio contact, without distress signals, without any indication of what happened to it or its 10-man crew. The disappearance was unusual and suspicious. The mission had been successful, weather was good, no Japanese fighters engaged the formation during egress, and Lucky Star had shown no mechanical problems during the bombing run. The aircraft simply disappeared somewhere between Wewak and Port Moresby, falling off radar and failing to arrive, becoming one of approximately 35 Zero-Zero aircraft that went missing during World War II without explanation. What made Lucky Star's disappearance infamous, rather than merely tragic, was what happened afterward. In April 1944, Japanese propaganda broadcasts claimed that an American bomber crew had defected to Japanese forces, that 10 Americans had landed their aircraft at a Japanese-controlled airfield and surrendered voluntarily, that they were providing intelligence about American bombing tactics and aircraft capabilities. The broadcasts didn't identify which crew had supposedly defected, but American military intelligence concluded that Lucky Star was the most likely candidate. It had disappeared without distress signals in an area where Japanese forces controlled airfields that could have received a defecting bomber. Its crew included 2 officers who'd been disciplined for insubordination and were considered potentially disloyal, and the timing matched Japanese propaganda claims about recent defections. The Army Air Forces investigated and concluded, without physical evidence but based on circumstantial analysis, that Lucky Star's crew had probably defected to Japanese forces, that the 10 men aboard were traitors who'd betrayed their country, that their families should be denied death benefits and military honors pending confirmation of their fate. The conclusion destroyed 10 families, marked them as relatives of traitors, created social stigma that persisted for decades as neighbors whispered that their sons or brothers or fathers had been cowards who'd chosen collaboration over combat. The families protested, insisted that the men wouldn't have defected, demanded investigation and physical evidence. But without Lucky Star's wreckage or bodies or definitive proof of what had actually happened, the defection conclusion stood. 10 men remained classified as probable traitors, their reputations destroyed by speculation that couldn't be proven, but also couldn't be definitively refuted. Now, 79 years later, Sarah is excavating Lucky Star's wreckage in Papua New Guinea Highlands, 180 kilometers southwest of where the aircraft supposedly defected to Japanese forces, in terrain so remote and mountainous that no Japanese airfields existed within 200 kilometers of the crash site. The wreckage location alone disproves the defection theory. Aircraft that land at Japanese airfields don't crash in mountains 180 kilometers away. But Sarah needs more than location evidence. She needs physical proof of what actually happened to Lucky Star, evidence explaining why the aircraft crashed, artifacts proving the crew died in the crash rather than defecting, forensic analysis that will finally clear 10 men's names and give their families the answers they've sought for 8 decades. Sarah's excavation will either provide that proof or will reveal that the mystery is unsolvable, that Lucky Star's secrets are too corroded and degraded to reconstruct, that the families will never have definitive answers about what happened to their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Brushing away more vegetation, Sarah exposes the pilot's compartment, crushed from impact but partially intact, containing what appears to be human remains still seated at the controls. The discovery confirms what crash location already suggested. Lucky Star didn't land safely at Japanese airfield, didn't defect voluntarily, didn't betray America. The aircraft crashed catastrophically in remote mountains, killing its crew instantly, disappearing not because the men chose treason, but because they died doing their jobs in circumstances that made their bodies and aircraft impossible to recover using 1944 technology. Sarah photographs the remains carefully, documenting position and condition, preparing for forensic analysis that will identify who's seated at the controls and what caused the crash that killed them. But Sarah also knows that proving Lucky Star crashed isn't the same as proving the crew didn't attempt to defect before crashing. That skeptics will argue the aircraft could have been attempting to reach Japanese territory when it crashed. That clearing the crew's names requires understanding not just that they died, but why they were flying where they crashed. What circumstances led them 180 kilometers off course into mountains where no rational flight path would take them. Sarah needs evidence explaining their deviation from planned route, artifacts proving they weren't attempting defection, physical proof that will satisfy families who've spent 79 years fighting accusations of treason against men who can't defend themselves. The rusted wreckage contains answers if Sarah can extract them before tropical climate, and time destroy evidence that survived nearly 8 decades in jungle conditions that corrode metal and degrade everything organic. Standing beside Lucky Star's wreckage, Sarah feels the weight of responsibility that comes with excavating sites where families' reputations depend on what you discover, where your forensic analysis will either vindicate or condemn men who've been dead for 79 years, where mistakes or missed evidence could mean families never get the answers they deserve. Sarah has excavated dozens of World War II crash sites, has learned to read wreckage like archaeologists read ancient ruins, to extract stories from twisted metal and corroded components, to reconstruct final moments from physical evidence that others see as meaningless junk. But this excavation is different because the stakes are higher. Because 10 families are waiting for answers Sarah might not be able to provide. Because proving innocence is harder than documenting death. Because clearing reputations requires evidence that survives when everything else has corroded into unreadable fragments. To understand why Lucky Star's disappearance created accusations of defection and why those accusations persisted for 79 years, you need to understand the paranoia and uncertainty that characterized World War II intelligence operations, and how missing aircraft were interpreted when physical evidence couldn't be recovered. Approximately 35 Aurododsiran aircraft went missing during World War II, disappearing without distress signals or crash sites or any indication of what happened to them or their crews. Most disappeared over water, where ocean depths made recovery impossible using 1940s technology. Some disappeared in remote terrain where search operations couldn't reach. Some were shot down and captured by enemy forces who didn't report captures. Some crashed in ways that left no recognizable debris. American military intelligence struggled to determine the fates of missing crews. Were they killed in crashes, captured by enemy forces, or had they defected? The question mattered enormously because it determined how families were notified, whether death benefits were paid, whether men received military honors, or were branded as traitors. In most cases, insufficient evidence meant that crews were classified as missing in action, rather than killed, captured, or defected, a bureaucratic category that left families in limbo, waiting for information that might never arrive. But in some cases, particularly when Japanese propaganda broadcasts claimed American defections, military intelligence felt pressured to make definitive conclusions about whether specific crews had defected. Classifications that were often based on circumstantial analysis rather than physical proof. Lucky Star's case involved several factors that made defection seem plausible to 1944 military intelligence despite lack of physical evidence. First, Japanese propaganda broadcasts in April 1944 claimed that an American bomber crew had recently defected. Second, Lucky Star had disappeared during the timeframe Japanese broadcasts referenced. Third, Lucky Star's disappearance occurred without distress signals in an area where Japanese forces controlled airfields that could receive defecting aircraft. Fourth, Lucky Star's crew included Lieutenant Robert Hayes and Lieutenant James Morrison, pilots who'd been disciplined for insubordination after questioning orders they considered unnecessarily dangerous, raising concerns about their loyalty and willingness to follow commands. Fifth, post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed that American bomber crews had occasionally approached Japanese positions and appeared to be attempting to defect before being shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire, suggesting that defection attempts occurred even if rarely successful. Based on these factors, Army Air Forces intelligence concluded in July 1944 that Lucky Star's crew had probably attempted defection, that the 10 men should be classified as missing under suspicious circumstances pending investigation, that their families should not receive death benefits or military honors until the crew's fate was definitively established. The conclusion was presented as tentative and subject to revision if additional evidence emerged, but in practice it became permanent classification that persisted because no additional evidence ever did emerge. Lucky Star's wreckage wasn't found during the war or in immediate post-war recovery operations. Japanese records captured after the war contained no mention of American bomber crews defecting in March 1944. Interrogations of Japanese officers produced no information about Lucky Star specifically. The aircraft and its crew simply vanished, leaving nothing but speculation that hardened into accepted history because no evidence contradicted it. The families of Lucky Star's crew fought the defection conclusion for decades. Robert Hayes's widow Elizabeth spent 42 years writing letters to military authorities, submitting evidence of her husband's patriotism and loyalty, demanding investigation and physical proof before her husband was branded a traitor. James Morrison's mother, Margaret, hired private investigators to search for Lucky Star's crash site, convinced that physical evidence would prove her son had died in combat rather than defecting. Other families formed support groups, shared information, coordinated advocacy efforts, tried to force the military to reconsider conclusions that seemed to be based on speculation rather than evidence. But without physical proof, without Lucky Star's wreckage or bodies or documents explaining what had actually happened, the families couldn't definitively disprove defection theory. The absence of evidence worked against them. If Lucky Star had simply crashed, why hadn't the wreckage been found? If the crew had died in combat, why did they disappear without distress signals? The questions seemed to support defection theory, even though they could be explained by remote crash location and 1944 search technology limitations. By 2000, all of Lucky Star's crew members would have been in their 80s if they'd survived the war. Their children were elderly. Their grandchildren were middle-aged. Their great-grandchildren were learning family history that included the stigma of accused defection. Elizabeth Hayes died in 1986 without ever learning what happened to her husband. Margaret Morrison died in 1993, still believing her son was innocent, but unable to prove it. Other families gradually stopped active advocacy as the generation that remembered the crew personally died, as the memory faded from living experience into historical curiosity, as the emotional investment weakened through generational distance. By 2010, only a few dozen people still cared deeply about Lucky Star's fate. Elderly children of crew members, genealogists researching family histories, military historians interested in World War II. Two mysteries. Aviation archaeologists like Sarah Chen, who specialized in locating and excavating missing aircraft. Sarah became interested in Lucky Star in 2017 while researching World War II bomber operations in Papua New Guinea. Reading mission reports that documented Lucky Star's disappearance and noting the unusual circumstances. Successful mission, good weather, no enemy contact, aircraft simply vanishing without explanation. Sarah noticed something that 1944 investigators had missed, or dismissed. Lucky Star's last known position was approximately 280 kilometers from Port Moresby, which meant the aircraft should have crashed somewhere along a 280-kilometer arc extending from Wewak toward Port Moresby. But Japanese-controlled airfields where defecting crew might have landed were all located north of that arc, toward Japanese bases rather than toward Allied territory. If Lucky Star had been attempting defection, it would have been flying toward Japanese territory when it disappeared. But the aircraft's last known position suggested it was flying toward Allied territory, away from Japanese forces, exactly what a non-defecting bomber would do. This observation made Sarah wonder whether Lucky Star had crashed in remote terrain along the Wewak to Port Moresby flight path, rather than defecting to Japanese territory, as military intelligence had concluded. In 2018, Sarah began researching oral histories from Papua New Guinea villages along that flight path, interviewing village elders who'd been children during World War II, asking whether anyone remembered seeing aircraft crash or finding wreckage in the highlands. Most remembered nothing useful. Papua New Guinea in the 1940s was remote territory, where aircraft frequently crashed and where villagers had learned to ignore distant explosions that meant nothing to their lives. But in 2019, Sarah interviewed 89-year-old Thomas Keela from a village near Mount Wilhelm, who remembered as a 7-year-old child seeing a silver bird fall from the sky trailing smoke, exploding on impact in highlands that were too remote and difficult to reach for his village to investigate at the time. Keela's memory was vague and unreliable in some details. He couldn't remember exactly when the crash occurred or precisely where it happened, but specific and consistent in other details that suggested he'd witnessed Lucky Star's crash. He remembered that the Silverbird had 4 engines, B-24s had 4 engines, Japanese aircraft in the region typically had 2. He remembered that the crash occurred during rainy season. March is rainy season in Papua New Guinea. He remembered that the explosion was enormous, consistent with bomber carrying fuel and possibly ordnance crashing at high speed. Most importantly, Keela remembered approximately where the crash occurred. In highlands southwest of Mount Wilhelm, near a ridge his village used for hunting, terrain so remote that reaching it required multiple days of trekking through jungle. Sarah organized expedition to search the area Keela described, trekking for 3 weeks through highlands that were still remote and difficult in 2020, navigating terrain that was nearly impassable during rainy season when Lucky Star crashed, understanding why 1944 search operations hadn't located the wreck despite Army Air Forces conducting aerial searches that should have spotted crash sites visible from above. The highlands where Keela directed Sarah were densely forested with triple canopy jungle that concealed ground from aerial observation, located in valleys where terrain features created radar shadows that prevented detection by ground-based radar. Positioned in territory that was technically under Japanese control in 1944, but so remote that neither Japanese nor Allied forces actually operated there. Sarah's expedition found Lucky Star's wreckage on June 15, 2023, exactly where Keela's childhood memory suggested it would be, scattered across a ridge at approximately 400 meters elevation, the aircraft having struck the ridge during what appeared to be controlled flight into terrain, the impact so violent that the bomber disintegrated on contact, leaving debris field approximately 400 meters long, descending the ridge's slope. The wreckage condition suggested that the aircraft had been flying level and under control when it hit the ridge, that the crash wasn't result of combat damage or mechanical failure, but of navigational error that led the crew into terrain they didn't see or couldn't avoid, that the 10 men died instantly from impact forces that crushed the aircraft and killed everyone aboard before they could react. Sarah's initial assessment solved Lucky Star's basic mystery. The aircraft hadn't defected, hadn't landed at Japanese airfield, hadn't betrayed America. The crew had simply flown into a mountain in remote terrain that made their bodies and aircraft impossible to recover using 1944 search technology, had disappeared not through treason, but through navigational error or mechanical problem that led them fatally off course. The defection theory that destroyed 10 families' reputations for 79 years was wrong, based on speculation rather than evidence, maintained because no physical proof contradicted it until Sarah's excavation finally provided definitive answer to what had happened to Lucky Star and its crew. But proving the aircraft crashed didn't fully explain why it was 180 kilometers off course when it crashed, why experienced pilots flew into mountain in good weather, why the crew didn't transmit distress signals if they knew they were lost or experiencing problems. Sarah needed to excavate more carefully, to recover artifacts that would explain the circumstances leading to the crash, to reconstruct Lucky Star's final minutes in ways that would answer not just what happened, but why it happened. What chain of events led professional bomber crew to fly into mountain terrain that should have been avoidable? The answers existed in the wreckage if Sarah could extract them despite 79 years of tropical climate-corroding evidence into fragments. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah and her team excavated Lucky Star's crash site systematically, documenting wreckage positions, photographing artifacts in situ before recovery, collecting components that might provide information about the aircraft's condition and crew's actions during final minutes. The excavation was painstaking and difficult. Jungle had reclaimed the crash site. Vegetation grew through wreckage. Tropical humidity had corroded aluminum into fragile lace that crumbled when touched. And 79 years of weathering had degraded or destroyed many artifacts that would have survived in drier climates. But Sarah's training in aviation archaeology provided skills for extracting information from degraded sites, for recognizing significant artifacts among corroded fragments, for reconstructing events from physical evidence that non-specialists would see as meaningless debris. The first crucial discovery was Lucky Star's cockpit instruments, partially intact despite impact damage, revealing that the aircraft's altimeter showed approximately 200 meters when the crash occurred despite the ridge being only 400 meters elevation. The discrepancy suggested altimeter error. The instrument was indicating altitude approximately 800 meters higher than the aircraft's actual altitude, leading the pilots to believe they were flying safely above terrain when they were actually at terrain level. Sarah recognized this as classic cause of controlled flight into terrain. Pilots trusting instruments that were providing incorrect information, flying confidently into mountains they thought were safely below them, dying because their instruments lied about altitude and they had no way to verify the error until impact occurred. But altimeter error alone didn't explain Lucky Star's crash, because experienced pilots should have recognized the error through visual references, should have noticed that terrain appeared closer than altimeter indicated, should have questioned instrument readings that didn't match what they could see outside. Sarah needed to understand why visual verification hadn't saved the crew. What prevented them from recognizing that their altimeter was wrong before flying into the mountain? The second crucial discovery explained the visual verification failure. Lucky Star's windscreen showed evidence of ice accumulation. Chemical analysis of residue on the windscreen revealed frozen water deposits that had accumulated on the glass, obscuring forward visibility, preventing pilots from seeing terrain ahead clearly enough to recognize that their altimeter was giving incorrect readings. The ice accumulation was unusual for Papua New Guinea's tropical climate, but consistent with flight through freezing temperatures at high altitude, suggesting that Lucky Star had climbed to high altitude during the mission, probably to avoid weather or enemy fighters, and had accumulated ice on windscreen that didn't sublimate quickly when the aircraft descended toward Port Moresby, because the descent occurred through humid air that maintained ice rather than allowing it to dissipate. The combination of altimeter error and ice-obscured windscreen explained Lucky Star's crash completely. The crew was flying with incorrect altitude information and reduced forward visibility, unable to see terrain clearly, and unable to recognize that their altimeter was wrong, confident they were flying safely above mountains that they actually were flying directly into. The circumstances were tragic, but not negligent. The crew had done everything professional pilots should do, had trusted their instruments, had attempted to maintain safe altitude, had made reasonable decisions based on information available to them. They died not from incompetence or treason, but from equipment failure combined with environmental conditions that prevented them from recognizing the failure until too late to avoid impact. Sarah's third crucial discovery provided emotional rather than technical understanding of Lucky Star's final minutes. She recovered the aircraft's intercom system, corroded but partially intact, still containing the last recording captured on the wire recorder that documented crew communications. Wire recorders in 1944 were primitive technology that recorded audio magnetically on thin steel wire. Technology that was fragile and degraded easily, but that sometimes survived decades if protected from moisture. Lucky Star's wire recorder had been in the tail section, partially protected from impact damage and environmental exposure, corroded extensively, but with some wire still intact enough that specialized restoration might recover recorded audio. Sarah sent the wire recorder to specialized laboratory in California that could process severely degraded magnetic recordings, explaining that the wire might contain the final communications of Lucky Star's crew, that recovering those communications would provide families with understanding of their relatives' final moments, that the audio might contain evidence further proving the crew hadn't defected, but had died attempting to complete their mission. The laboratory spent 4 months cleaning and processing the wire, using techniques developed for recovering audio from degraded tape recordings, gradually extracting fragments of conversation that had been magnetically encoded on steel wire 79 years earlier. In November 2023, the laboratory delivered restored audio to Sarah. 7 minutes of fragmentary conversation recorded during Lucky Star's final flight. Voices of men who'd been dead for nearly 8 decades, preserved accidentally by technology that captured their last words and stored them in wreckage that took 79 years to discover. The audio was incomplete and damaged, with sections lost to corrosion and environmental degradation, but enough survived to reconstruct Lucky Star's final minutes and provide definitive proof that the crew hadn't defected, but had died fighting to save their aircraft when equipment failure and environmental conditions combined to create circumstances they couldn't overcome. The recovered audio began with routine communications. Pilot Robert Hayes and co-pilot James Morrison discussing fuel status and navigation, checking position against landmarks, maintaining normal crew coordination that characterized professional bomber operations. The tone was calm and professional, voices of experienced airmen doing familiar work competently. Nothing in early conversation suggested problems or unusual circumstances, just routine flight management by crew that had completed dozens of previous missions successfully. At approximately 4 minutes into the recording, Morrison's voice noted something unusual. Altimeter reading seems high, showing 200 meters, but terrain looks closer than that should be. Hayes responded, "Could be instrument error. Check the backup." Morrison, "Backup shows same reading, but I'm getting uncomfortable with terrain clearance. Should we climb?" Hayes, "We're already at max cruise altitude for fuel efficiency. If we climb higher, we won't have reserves to reach Port Moresby. I think the altimeters are reading correctly, and terrain just looks closer because of the haze." The conversation revealed that the crew had recognized something was wrong, had noticed the discrepancy between altimeter readings and visual terrain appearance, had discussed the problem, and made reasonable decision to trust their instruments rather than visual assessment that might be distorted by atmospheric conditions. The decision was fatal but defensible. Pilots are trained to trust instruments when visual references are ambiguous. Instruments are generally more reliable than visual estimates of altitude and distance, and Lucky Star's crew had no reason to believe both their altimeters were simultaneously wrong by the same margin. At approximately 5 minutes, Morrison's voice became concerned. "Bob, I'm really uncomfortable. Terrain is getting closer. I think we need to climb now regardless of fuel." Hayes, "All right. Climbing to 500 meters. Sound of engines increasing power." Pause. Then Morrison, urgently, "Bob, there's a ridge ahead, maybe 2 kilometers. I don't think we're going to clear it at this rate of climb." Hayes, "I see it. Full power. Nose up." The final 90 seconds of recording captured Lucky Star's crew fighting to avoid impact they realized was imminent. Engines straining at maximum power, aircraft climbing desperately, crew members shouting warnings and position reports, everyone working together to save the aircraft in circumstances where salvation was impossible because they'd recognized the danger too late to overcome momentum and climb rate limitations. The voices weren't panicked, but were intensely focused. Professional airmen doing their jobs under extreme stress, fighting until the moment of impact that killed them all instantly and ended the recording in abrupt silence. The audio proved conclusively that Lucky Star's crew hadn't defected, hadn't attempted to land at Japanese airfield, hadn't betrayed America. The men had died doing their jobs, trusting their instruments, making reasonable decisions based on information available to them, fighting to save their aircraft until the last moment when physics and terrain made survival impossible. The defection theory that destroyed their reputations for 79 years was completely wrong, maintained by military authorities who'd based conclusions on speculation rather than evidence, accepted by public who'd assumed guilt without proof, perpetuated through decades because no one could definitively prove innocence until Sarah's excavation recovered physical evidence that finally cleared 10 men's names. In December 2023, Sarah organized press conference to announce Lucky Star's discovery and present forensic evidence proving the crew hadn't defected. The conference was attended by descendants of Lucky Star's crew, military historians, and journalists covering the story that was ending 79 years after it began. Sarah presented her findings methodically. Crash location proved the aircraft was flying toward Allied territory when it crashed. Altimeter error and ice-obscured windscreen explained why the crew flew into terrain they should have avoided. Recovered audio documented that the crew fought to save their aircraft until impact, all evidence conclusively demonstrating that Lucky Star's disappearance resulted from equipment failure and environmental conditions rather than defection or treason. The impact on families was immediate and overwhelming. James Morrison's daughter, Patricia, 81 years old, attended the press conference and heard her father's voice for the first time in 79 years, listening to audio of him warning about terrain and fighting to save the aircraft, finally having proof that her father hadn't been a traitor, but had died serving his country. Robert Hayes's grandson, Michael, 56 years old, learned that his grandfather's reputation would finally be restored, that military authorities would reconsider the 1944 defection classification, that the family stigma that had marked 3 generations would end with definitive proof of innocence. The emotional responses were complex and difficult. Relief that the truth was finally known, anger that 79 years had been lost to false accusations, grief reopened by hearing voices of men who'd been dead for decades, satisfaction that justice had finally arrived, even though it came far too late for the generation that fought hardest for vindication. Patricia Morrison told Sarah, "My mother died believing my father was innocent, but never having proof. She spent 42 years writing letters and demanding investigation and being dismissed as a widow who couldn't accept that her husband was a traitor. She never got to hear this audio, never got to have vindication, never got to be right publicly after being told she was wrong privately for decades. I'm grateful that the truth is known now, but I'm angry it took 79 years, that my mother died without answers, that my father's reputation was destroyed by speculation that no one bothered to verify before accepting it as fact." See to the Sarah understood Patricia's anger and grief. The archaeological discovery had solved Lucky Star's mystery, but couldn't repair the damage caused by 79 years of false accusations, couldn't restore opportunities lost to families marked as relatives of traitors, couldn't compensate for the pain caused by military authorities making definitive classifications based on insufficient evidence. Truth discovered in 2023 was valuable but inadequate. It cleared reputations but couldn't undo decades of stigma. It proved innocence but couldn't restore honor to men who'd been denied it for 8 decades. It provided answers but revealed that those answers should have been sought more carefully in 1944 before condemning men without physical proof. In January 2024, the Department of Defense officially reversed Lucky Star's missing under suspicious circumstances classification, acknowledging that forensic evidence proved the crew had died in combat-related accident rather than defecting, that the 1944 defection theory had been based on insufficient evidence and circumstantial analysis, that the 10 men deserved military honors and recognition that had been denied them for 79 years. The announcement included formal apology to families, acknowledgement that military authorities had failed to adequately investigate before making accusations that destroyed reputations, commitment to reviewing other World War II cases where missing personnel were classified as probable defectors without physical evidence supporting those classifications. The reversal was significant but incomplete. It cleared Lucky Star's crew officially, but didn't explain why 1944 military intelligence had been so willing to conclude defection without physical proof, why families' protests had been dismissed for decades, why the system had maintained false accusations rather than acknowledging uncertainty and continuing investigation. The Department of Defense's statement focused on correcting the error without examining the institutional failures that caused it, on apologizing for specific wrong without addressing systemic problems that allowed speculation to become accepted fact, on vindicating one crew without questioning how many other crews might have been similarly wrongly accused. Sarah continued excavating Lucky Star's crash site through February 2024, recovering remains of all 10 crew members for return to families for proper burial, collecting artifacts for museum preservation, documenting the site thoroughly before the excavation ended, and Jungle reclaimed the crash location. The work was emotionally difficult, handling remains of men who'd died 80 years ago, packaging bones and personal effects for return to families who'd waited 8 decades for bodies to bury, closing a crash site that would likely never be visited again after Sarah's team departed. Each artifact recovered represented life interrupted. Identification tags bearing names of young men who'd enlisted believing they'd serve honorably and return home. Wedding rings that wives had placed on fingers decades ago. Letters from families that men had carried into combat. Watches stopped at the moment of impact that killed their owners. The most poignant artifact Sarah recovered was a journal belonging to Robert Hayes, discovered in the pilot's compartment, corroded and fragmentary, but with some pages intact enough to read. Hayes had written regularly during his service, documenting missions and thoughts and observations about the war and his role in it. The final entry, dated March 6, 1944, the day before Lucky Star's final mission, expressed Hayes's concerns about the war's costs and his hope that his service contributed to ending it quickly. Flew another mission today. Successfully bombed target, but watched 2 bombers from our group get shot down on the way out. 20 men gone in seconds. I keep thinking about whether what we're doing is worth the costs, whether strategic bombing actually shortens the war or just kills more people on both sides. I don't know the answer. I just know that I enlisted to serve, that I'll keep flying until the war ends or I die, and that I hope my family remembers me as someone who did his duty even when that duty was difficult and morally complicated. Sarah read Hayes's journal entry at the press conference announcing the completion of Lucky Star's excavation, sharing Hayes's words as evidence that the crew understood the moral complexity of their service, that they questioned whether their actions were justified while continuing to perform them because they believed duty required completion, regardless of doubts. Hayes's words provided human context for men who'd been reduced to classified file numbers and speculation, revealed them as people who struggled with the same questions about war's purpose and morality that every generation asks, demonstrated that serving honorably doesn't mean serving without doubt, or that dying in service means dying without questioning whether that service was right. The families held memorial service in March 2024, 80 years after Lucky Star's crash, burying remains that had been recovered from Papua New Guinea highlands, finally giving 10 men the military honors that had been denied them for 8 decades. The service was attended by approximately 200 people, descendants of the crew, veterans of World War II bomber operations, military historians, aviation archaeologists, and Sarah Chen, who'd spent 6 years searching for Lucky Star and 3 months excavating it. The ceremony was simultaneously closure and reminder of injustice. Closure because the crew's bodies could finally be properly buried. Reminder because proper burial should have occurred 80 years earlier if military authorities had investigated more thoroughly before condemning men as probable traitors. Patricia Morrison gave eulogy for her father and his crew, speaking about the 79 years her family had spent fighting false accusations, the relief of finally having proof of innocence, the anger that vindication came so late. My father and his crew died serving their country on March 7, 1944. They died in seconds when their aircraft hit a mountain they didn't see because their instruments were wrong and their windscreen was iced over. That's a tragedy. What happened afterward was injustice. Military authorities accused them of defection without proof, condemned them as traitors without investigation, maintained those accusations for 79 years despite my mother's protests and despite having no physical evidence supporting the accusations. My mother died without vindication. My father died without honor. Both things were preventable, if authorities had been more careful about making accusations without proof, if they'd treated uncertainty as reason to continue investigating rather than reason to conclude guilt. Sarah attended the memorial service, feeling satisfaction at having solved Lucky Star's mystery, mixed with discomfort about her role in excavating human remains for purposes that felt partly like justice and partly like making archaeological career from tragedy. Sarah had become aviation archaeologist because she believed that missing airmen deserved to be found, that families deserved answers about what happened to their relatives, that physical evidence could solve mysteries that oral history and archival research couldn't resolve. Lucky Star's excavation had achieved those goals. The aircraft was found, the mystery was solved, the families received answers they'd sought for 80 years. But achieving those goals required treating human remains as archaeological data, required disturbing graves that had been undisturbed for 8 decades, required extracting bodies from crash sites for transportation and analysis and eventual reburial in circumstances that felt respectful but also felt like violation. Sarah had learned to live with that discomfort, accepting that excavating crash sites was ethically complicated work that served important purposes while requiring actions that felt wrong even when they were right. Recovering remains for return to families was good. Disturbing graves was bad. Both statements were true. Neither canceled the other. Sarah understood that solving mysteries sometimes required accepting moral ambiguity, that doing good work could feel terrible, that the right thing to do was often the thing that felt most uncomfortable. Lucky Star's excavation had been right. The families deserved answers. The crew deserved vindication. The truth mattered. But rightness didn't eliminate discomfort about handling remains of men who died violently 80 years ago, about turning tragedy into archaeological data, about building career from recovering bodies. In May 2024, the National Museum of World War II Aviation opened permanent exhibit about Lucky Star, displaying artifacts recovered from the crash site. Sikinaon, presenting the forensic evidence that solved the mystery, telling the story of 10 men who were wrongly accused of defection and whose reputations were restored 79 years after their deaths. The exhibit included photographs of the crew, transcripts of recovered audio, Hayes's journal entries, artifacts that personalized the men beyond their roles as aircraft crew, and Sarah's explanation of the archaeological investigation that located and excavated the crash site. The exhibit also included critical examination of how military authorities had concluded defection without adequate evidence, how families had been denied answers for decades, how institutional failures had perpetuated injustice that physical evidence eventually corrected. The exhibit attracted significant attention, both for solving a 79-year-old mystery and for raising questions about how many other missing crews might have been wrongly accused of defection without physical proof, how military authorities should balance the need for definitive classifications against the risk of making false accusations, whether families of missing personnel deserve access to continuing investigation rather than premature conclusions based on speculation. Several veterans' organizations called for systematic review of World War II cases where personnel were classified as probable defectors or deserters without physical evidence, arguing that Lucky Star's vindication suggested other crews might have been similarly wrongly accused and that those cases deserved reinvestigation using modern forensic techniques. The Department of Defense responded cautiously, acknowledging that some historical classifications might have been premature, but noting that reinvestigating thousands of missing personnel cases would require resources that current budgets couldn't support, that many cases lacked sufficient information to reach definitive conclusions even with modern techniques, that raising families' expectations for answers that might not be achievable could cause more harm than accepting historical uncertainty. The response was bureaucratically reasonable but emotionally inadequate. It protected institutional resources while failing to acknowledge that families who'd been told definitive false conclusions for decades deserved efforts to correct those conclusions even when correction was expensive and difficult. Sarah understood the Department of Defense's position while disagreeing with its implications. Resources were limited. Not every case could be reinvestigated. But that didn't mean no cases should be reinvestigated. That families should accept false conclusions because correction was expensive. That institutional convenience should outweigh justice for people who'd been wrongly accused without proof. Sarah had spent 6 years searching for Lucky Star because she believed one family deserved answers. That belief didn't scale to thousands of families. Sarah couldn't spend 6 years investigating one cases, but it suggested that some cases beyond Lucky Star deserved investigation. That families who'd spent decades protesting classifications they believed were wrong deserved resources to search for evidence that might vindicate their relatives. In June 2024, Sarah received a letter from descendant of another crew that disappeared in 1944 under circumstances that led to defection accusations, asking whether Sarah would consider investigating that case using techniques that had solved Lucky Star's mystery. Sarah read the letter and felt the weight of responsibility that came with successful investigation creating expectations she couldn't fulfill. She'd proven that finding missing aircraft and excavating crash sites could solve decades-old mysteries and clear wrongly accused crews' reputations, but proving it was possible didn't mean she could do it repeatedly for every family that deserved answers. Sarah had resources and time for perhaps one more major excavation. Maybe 2 if funding materialized, but not for the dozens or hundreds of families who would contact her requesting investigations they believed would vindicate their relatives if someone would just search as persistently as Sarah had searched for Lucky Star. Sarah responded honestly to the letter. She couldn't promise to investigate every case, couldn't guarantee that investigations would find aircraft or solve mysteries even when conducted, couldn't provide the answers every family deserved because resources and time were finite and mysteries were abundant. But Sarah also committed to reviewing the case the letter described, to determining whether available information suggested the aircraft might be locatable, to pursuing investigation if preliminary research indicated reasonable probability of success. Sarah understood that she couldn't solve every mystery, couldn't give every family the closure Patricia Morrison had received at Lucky Star's memorial service. But Sarah could solve some mysteries, could give some families answers, could demonstrate that wrongly accused crews deserved investigation even 80 years after their deaths, and even when investigation was expensive and difficult. The invitation Lucky Star's story extends isn't about archaeology specifically or World War II generally. It's about recognizing that accusations without proof create injustices that persist until physical evidence proves innocence. That institutional certainty based on speculation causes harm that lasts generations. That families deserve investigations seeking truth rather than premature conclusions protecting institutional convenience. Lucky Star's crew was accused of defection without physical proof, condemned as traitors based on circumstantial analysis, denied military honors because speculation hardened into accepted history that persisted for 79 years until archaeological excavation recovered evidence proving innocence. The accusation destroyed families' reputations, created stigma that marked 3 generations, denied closure that could have been provided if military authorities had investigated more thoroughly before concluding guilt. Sarah Chen spent 6 years searching for Lucky Star because she believed the crew deserved vindication, that families deserved answers, that physical evidence could solve mysteries that speculation couldn't. Sarah's excavation proved the crew died in combat accident rather than defecting, cleared reputations that had been unjustly destroyed. gave families the answers they'd sought for 8 decades. That success demonstrates that solving old mysteries matters, that justice delayed for 79 years is still justice worth pursuing, that investigations seeking truth are valuable even when expensive and difficult. But success also demonstrates limits. Sarah can investigate some cases, but not all cases, can provide some answers, but not every answer, can demonstrate that vindication is possible without guaranteeing it for every wrongly accused crew that deserves it. What injustices are persisting because investigating them thoroughly seems too expensive or difficult? What accusations are being maintained without physical proof because overturning them would require admitting institutional failures? What families are being denied closure because providing it would mean acknowledging that premature conclusions were wrong? Lucky Star's rusted wreck solved 79-year-old mystery by providing physical evidence that finally cleared 10 men's names, proved they died serving rather than betraying their country, demonstrated that accusations without proof create injustices that persist until someone invests the effort to search for truth that could have been found decades earlier if authorities had investigated before condemning. That lesson applies beyond World War II archaeology. It suggests that certainty without evidence is dangerous, that accusations require proof before acceptance, that families deserve investigations rather than speculation, that justice matters even when delayed, that truth is worth pursuing regardless of how long the pursuit takes or how inconvenient the truth proves to be.